Howdy, all you delicious people. Today I'm going to be reviewing the 2017 Power Rangers movie. So, ultimately, my first time around, my first consensus about a review of this film would probably be that the story is really solid, really good, and the visuals are just kind of really just the exact opposite. Now, really very much pulling the story apart as well as looking at the visuals again for the second time around, because I already knew about the visuals. Now I'm like pulling apart the story. I'm really starting to realize some different kind of perspectives, some different kind of things when watching this film back again years later. So, looking at this movie, first off, we are supposed to realize that Power Rangers is supposed to be a film that is very much to be presenting a team within it. And I would honestly say that this film does not do that. Reasonably, we have it to where there are in several other kind of seasons of Power Rangers, there might honestly be favorites and stuff like that. Ultimately, there might have been characters that have been pushed more to the forefront than others. Looking at Power Rangers Samurai, we have it to be in the very first episode. They only really focus on the Red Ranger, and then the rest come afterwards. Or in like Wild Force, we have all the other supporting Power Rangers come up first, but then eventually within the pilot episode they eventually get their Red Ranger leader, and so on and so forth. Going into this thing, it seems that we should all be getting these characters at the same time, and every single one of them should all have equal focus. It seems like there are some characters that completely drop off to me as just like, okay, this person is irrelevant in this movie, which is bizarre because they are a Power Ranger and they should have equal focus to everyone else. There are certain characters that chime in every once in a while, but again, reasonably, like the main focus is probably more than anything on one person. Basically, saying how the entire portion of Angel Grove really rests and dies on otherwise one character, which I thought was really bizarre. Going into this movie, you have Zordon being done very differently than its original source material. When looking at Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, a lot of times Zordon would kind of motivate the Power Rangers, or ultimately mention that he believed in them, or that ultimately, like all along, he trusts them and this and that. And ultimately, within this movie, it seems that Zordon is much more of a character that is very much self-centered, and reasonably he naturally assumes that he would do a much more better job than the Power Rangers themselves. And that basically he is a guy that is consistently like looking at his watch, just going, okay, come on, like we gave you the power coins, like now go and save the world. And these people don't even know what they're doing. Obviously, it quite painfully comes off as these this team has no clue what they're doing, and reasonably, I guess they just like have a bizarrish montage of them learning how to fight, and reasonably it like we spend way too much time with them learning how to be Power Rangers rather than actually having them literally being Power Rangers. Like, it's so bizarre to eventually have them, when they actually put on the suits and they actually fight with the suits on, how basically there is not enough time for them actually being in the suits, because basically, like, we quickly have them in the suits, but then they quickly shift into going right into just being within the Zords. Like there really isn't enough time for like really enough of the action moments that were really just like okay, like man, we had a long buildup of just one character, and but not only that, we had a long buildup of Jason and Zordon, and really that just like is blatantly obvious because they're the biggest probably actors in this movie compared to everyone else. More than likely, there's probably uh, someone going to tell me it's like, oh no, well this character has actually done this movie now, and he's actually a much more bigger character than either Bryan Cranston or so and so. And I'm like, yeah, that's great, but reasonably, when looking at this, during this time, you can obviously tell that some people are just like were probably just happy to be there, and probably weren't ultimately like kind of mentioning it's like, well, hey, like, why is it that this isn't a teen film? Because it doesn't feel like that to me. There is, I think, too many allusions to there being a sequel to this movie already, as if they're gonna like. I think that they should have just bottlenecked this as it being its own thing and not already having to push some kind of agenda with there being a sequel. Reasonably, when looking at this movie, we if you're going to build to a sequel, here could have been a very interesting way to do this. Rita and any number of villains through any portions of times have eventually presented evil Power Rangers within this show. If Rita is going to be who she is in this movie, I'm trying to avoid spoilers as much as possible. You would think then that that would build up to there being multiple evil rangers. If anything, people love and or have a huge affection for the Psycho Rangers, and you would think that that full fledgedly that would have probably been the real first villains of this show. Like you would have had the Power Rangers going up against the Psycho Rangers, and then quite obviously maybe that would have really shut Zordon up to just say, hey, yeah, like we took down an entire team of Rangers to really cement that we deserve to be here. And then Zordon would have really just been like, well, yeah, obviously, like the coins like chose you, yeah, like of course, because I knew all along. I was just pushing you guys uh to get you to be the people that I knew you could be. But instead, like Zordon is just like looking at his watch, going like, "Okay, come on, like we gave you the coins there, buddy." So, also going into this film, we have it to where within this film that like we don't have enough time for any of the actual fun portions of a Power Rangers movie. It's really that you have to spend way too much time investing in characters to not have a good enough payoff at the end. The one upside to this movie is I actually thought that the Zord portion of this movie was actually really good, with the exception of any visuals. The best part that I think about the Zords is when you literally have every single Power Ranger having to physically control one portion of Zord body. And I think that is probably the best thing about this movie is you literally have one person controlling one portion of said body, and I thought that that was really good. And I wish that they would always do that and always get to that. There's plenty of times where you would just reasonably have it to where um, every single ranger is all like just shoved all into this hangar Ashlike Bay, and like one person is really driving the Zord, And then of course you have to have all these like bizarrish uh like uh like motions to cue up the Zord to ultimately tell him it's like, oh yeah, let's bring in the Ranger Blade to where it slices through the villain this week. And yeah. So going into this, yeah, it just reasonably, there's a lot of portions of time that is kind of eaten up by, I think, taking too long to get the coins, too long to get to what is the command center in this movie. And reasonably, I think it's also taking way too long to not really properly build up a villain, and to when the heroes are going up against the villain, basically the only build up of the villain is that the Power Rangers are, of course, losing against it. It's like, well, that's because there is no build up to that. It's just basically straight up. It's like you have it to where it's the Rangers and Rita, and that's not it. And that's pretty much all it. Like if you watch the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, like we get like we have to build up to getting to like a Rita-esh level villain. Like reasonably, we have to have little minions um, of Ivan Ooze, and then eventually we have to get to uh, have it to where the command center ends up getting annihilated. To ultimately, it leads up to the Rangers now having to go through all these obstacles to regain Ninjetti powers to ultimately now come back to the world to then ultimately then take on um, Ivan Ooze, but also having to fight his Zords as well to eventually, yeah. So there's much more of a build up, which I think they should have done much more on instead of just like right away, just like, yeah, Rita's in their face, and ultimately, like she's finding out where they live, and she's like decking them all to the point where eventually, when you have not even Rita really fighting the characters at the end of this, there's another side character that is just slowly but surely being built up by only reference alone. That's the toughest part about this movie. Is just you have like the real villain of this film is built up via reference the entire time. Yeah, it's yeah, that is the roughest part of this film, is just the fact that we have the real monster of this film isn't really going to be an important thing because Rita is just a placeholder for, like, if you watch Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, like Rita is a placeholder, and then whoever she sends out to take on, yeah, it's just like that is the confusing thing of like Rita's here, but like, she's not like when she actually is going against the Rangers, she is very much just not fully fledgedly like really there. She's not really there because ultimately she's fighting them, but if anything, she's pulling back because ultimately knows full well that basically if she really tried, she could kill every single one of them. She's playing with her food instead of eating it, and but then ultimately when it gets to the point to where okay, like stuff is really going to get real because now the Power Rangers have really are now in the suits and this and that. Now Rita just is like, well, okay, well now I'm just going to take a back seat. What? Like you would think even much more so Rita would be to the forefront and desperately just go, okay, well yeah, Goldar, yeah, you're gonna be you're gonna be the gold goop villain of this thing, but then I am also going to like step in and really just just start like also being the person who I end up becoming in the beginning of this movie, to also be a double Esh like threat. That's why I think that there should have been two different teams, because ultimately we could have had an entire like two different kind of Zords to fight this same threat, or ultimately you could have had uh, the Zords kind of very much separate for much longer and had them fight two different characters, but then eventually come back together to fight the one, which is, of course, Goldar. Um, could have been better. Could have been better. So let's go into spoilers about this movie, because at the end of the day, let's go out of our way to just kind of talk about this movie. Um, so yeah, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time again to spoil this movie. So now, spoilers. So recently we spend way too much time with Jason's story. But not only that, we also have to give you a Zordon backstory, which actually I actually like much more than just, hey, he's just a head and some kind of fish tank. It's much better this way. So in the very beginning of this movie, we have Bryan Cranston, who is ultimately speaking alien language, which kind of feels very pointless to me. I'm like, why do we have to spend a beginning of a movie saying an alien language that ultimately we have to read subtitles for? Why couldn't they just speak in English? Because reasonably, who actually cares about having having this alien language here? Because like I get it, like I guess they're supposed to have like, but it just feels like a moot point to have all this like, yeah, we have to learn this language for a couple dialogues of scene, and then kind of becomes pointless, to be brutally honest. But we ultimately find out that Bryan Cranston was the original Red Ranger, and then ultimately all the other Rangers had died off. So ultimately, Zordon is very much going into the mode of like, yeah, all my other team has died, so I'm going to take all of my power crystals and hide them somewhere, which is not really all that creatively hidden. But then we are gonna drop a meteor onto the world, because if we can't, uh, if ultimately if the Rangers can't save the world, then ultimately they're going to have to just completely and utterly annihilate it to have Rita not be able to rule it. So we ultimately find out that Rita was the original Green Ranger, which ultimately is never after this point showcased through any number of this film to say, okay, yeah, she's here's a little treasure trove that, yeah, Rita's the original Green Ranger, but we don't do anything past that of this film. Rita doesn't hand it off to a younger Green Ranger. She doesn't even go back into the Green Ranger Ash-like suit through any of this movie. It's just that she's Rita, and that's all that matters. Because I guess ultimately, when she was annihilated within the meteors, she just becomes like, oh no, she's gonna just be right back to being a witch character for the rest of this movie. So we, and here's the thing, so we have it to where Zordon, like, he very much gets annihilated and actually killed, but Rita, it seems for her that she has this bizarrish Wolverine like healing factor that slowly but surely uh like gets her to come back to being who she was originally. So an entire nuclear like blast of sorts isn't going to do nothing to Rita. So either way, if ultimately the power coins weren't to be seen or found by another team, Rita would just re come back into annihilating this world yet again. So it kind of feels like Zordon basically like took himself down for nothing. He killed himself for nothing. Because ultimately, Rita is still going to be a fully fledged character that is just going to come back. But I guess, reasonably, I guess Zordon's meteor move was just like a last resort ditch effort to ultimately just try to take Rita down, if anything. But yeah, that's what it just comes off as. So we have it to where now the coin's buried deep down somewhere in some cave. So we have it to where there is a crap ton of time of too much focusing on Jason. We find out that he had performed this prank of delivering some cow to some other high school, and so ultimately that is leaving him on to being a house arrested like kid, ultimately knowing fully fledgedly that this kid has to be home by 7, or otherwise the police force is going to be after him, and that ultimately he is also going to probably spend the rest of his life in detention because he missed a football game that would ultimately lead him to having a full ride scholarship, because this guy had the whole entire town riding on him to produce to be their star player, because ultimately when Jason didn't show up for the game, ultimately they lost, I would assume, and everybody is looking at Jason like he is the person that ran over their dog, because ultimately this city relies way too much on football and or whatever sport that Jason is in. And so now we have it to where, because I guess Angel Grove doesn't really have anything to rely on to besides maybe what would probably be Power Rangers now, with the exclusion of when Power Rangers eventually go into several different cities and stuff like that, and it's not Angel Grove anymore, because I think there's like Bryan Woods and all kinds of other weird settings that every single Power Rangers show eventually goes into at some point, which ultimately, I honestly would think would be great for Power Rangers to finally fully fledgedly have a console game out there that is actually a legitimate console game that has like all of these settings in place, and it's not just like regurgitating the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers like the mega battle thing, which I honestly like, but when looking at it, yeah, it's kind of like it is what it is with that series, because it's just kind of like, okay, it's just kind of retelling the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers things, and it's just recycling it. So we have it to where Jason ultimately in detention, and he ultimately does a dirty slap to one of the bullies that is in the detention. He slaps him, and ultimately Billy Cranston, which is Cranston. I wonder, like, it's kind of weird the name Cranston. Maybe, like, I don't think they were probably looking at uh, Bryan Cranston or whatever as an original like name. I don't think Bryan Cranston was anything when this original Power Ranger series came out. But anyways, moot point. So Billy ultimately is met to Jason because they're detention buddies, and ultimately Jason slaps the bully that is torturing Billy, because reasonably there is some bully that I guess is supposed to be the new age, like Bulk, because I guess you don't have Bulk and Skull in this series. I guess that's not really alluded to. You just have like some people that are just very much bullies and this and that. And so, anyways, we have it to where Jason dirty slaps a bully, and Billy has to be so amazed that Jason slapped somebody. It's uh, like, did you seriously just slap him? And Jason's like, yeah, I know, weird, right? So, reasonably, since Jason went to Billy's evade, Billy goes to Jason and ultimately is trying to be his best friend. Ultimately telling him that, hey, like, I really need to go down to my father's caves to just do some spelunking, and so ultimately I want you to come with me. Reasonably, of course, Jason can't go out there because he has to be home by 7. He has to be home by the dinner bell, or otherwise he is going to be very much in trouble with these people called the police because ultimately he's on house arrest. So Billy concocts this notion of being able to beat this said uh, house arrest device by having some mechanical adjustment to be able to have it to where Jason's leg tag ultimately showcases that he is supposedly at home, which he is not. So now we ultimately have to fully fledgedly start to present some of these characters within this movie, because the main focus isn't even on them, but we still have to eventually present them within this movie eventually. So we have it to where in this movie that we have Kimberly in this kind of clique ash like of people, and so ultimately it seems that her clique at some point rejects her, and so I think she is with a clique where basically they all grow long hair. And basically, at some point, they must have told her, it's like, well, hey, yeah, you really look good with really long hair, and we all have long hair. So it's some kind of bizarre like clique with something to do with hair. So eventually, when Kimberly ends up being put into detention, and basically her clique rejects her, ultimately she decides to otherwise go like, well, okay, well, since I'm not one of you anymore, I'm going to cut my own hair. So Kimberly ends up cutting her hair shorter, which ultimately every single person in the world has to notice, oh my god, this person has shorter hair. Oh my god, she's much more attractive to me now. Oh my god, like if anything, this girl that was already good looking now with shorter hair is even much more so good looking. And so reasonably bizarrely, it seems like Jason and Kimberly are going to quasi supposedly seemingly have a relationship in this movie because ultimately we have it to where Kimberly and Jason have this moment alone together where ultimately Kimberly is um, kind of mentioning about this town and ultimately that like she doesn't like how she's seen and stuff like that, and Jason is like, well, yeah, likewise, like if anything, like to be the star quarterback of this school and to ultimately not produce what everybody wanted you to produce kind of leaves them with a sour taste in your mouth. So we ultimately have seemingly Kimberly and Jason on the same wavelength. It seems like they're like-minded people that have their own cliques or have their own uh, kind of way about thinking about stuff. And so we ultimately have all these people all in detentions and this and that. So we have Billy that goes off to these caves and eventually alluding to these caves, showcasing even more people, aka Zach and Trini. Trini to me honestly is kind of like a very Batman Ash like character. She's very dark and brooding in this movie, and of course she doesn't really have much lines to say because ultimately, if Kimberly isn't talking smack to Trini or vice versa, there isn't much of an exchange for them to really realistically do. If anything, at some point, like Trini and or Zach come off as these uh, people that are very much like talking smackish like characters. Zach, when eventually he is using binoculars to spy on Trini, ultimately kind of vying for her affections, to ultimately ask if she has a boyfriend towards the later portions of this movie. We And we ultimately find out that that's all kind of null and void because Trini actually is much more interested in women, much more so than boys. So within this movie, we have them all jockeying for position to get to this cave to ultimately have it to where um, Billy is wanting Jason Jason to drive him to this cave so ultimately he can do some mining, and ultimately then Jason can just F off and do whatever he wants afterwards because he'll have a car for several hours. So ultimately Billy goes down and ultimately tries to use explosives in this cave, and Jason goes off to eventually meet Kimberly again, brings her down there to ultimately just kind of like, yeah, we don't have very much where anywhere else to go. So here's where we have Zach and Trini, who are ultimately kind of the looky loos that are ultimately just like noticing what these people are doing and are ultimately just kind of asking them questions or why they are even here. So we eventually have it to where Billy ends up detonating the explosions of this of this rock, of this cave, of this whatever, and eventually stumbles upon rocks that are ultimately kind of glowing certain colors. So eventually they end up cracking the rocks even more to realize that there are seemingly small little rocks that are glowing with colors. It starts to be that everybody starts to grab seemingly the colors that would probably otherwise tie into their mood ring of the week. And so we have, of course, them all grabbing their rocks, and then they otherwise notice that there is some security guard like presence, and so they all start to crazily run off. And Jason and Billy are kind of being chased by this police force, so ultimately they are trying to, as crazily as possible, book it out of there. So everybody ends up getting away, and the very next day, they are all realizing that they all bizarrely now have superpowers. And I'm kind of very much like, I'm on the fence about this whole superpower thing because I honestly kind of feel that they only do the whole superpower thing because they know people love superpower or superhero films. Recently this movie kind of comes off to me as like Captain America, where it's like, okay, overnight, like, or like Spider-Man, where it's like, okay, overnight, like these people wake up one day and they realize that they're superheroes, but now they have absolutely, they know nothing of what to really do with with these powers. So if anything, eventually we have it to where Billy, Jason, and Kimberly are all kind of freaked out and all kind of mentioning it's like, hey, did you wake up with superpowers? Yeah, I woke up with some superpowers. Yeah, I'm really strong. Yeah, I'm this. Yeah, I'm that. So basically, all three of them all are placing their power coins in front of one another, but then realize that the power coins are all of a sudden melting uh, the the place that they set the coins on, and so ultimately they grab the coins and then walk off. So eventually they taper off later to re-meet up with every single one of the uh, people with the coins. So ultimately ask them about their experiences with having these coins. And ultimately, basically, we have it to where they are mentioning like how like some of them can jump really high and this and that. So eventually we have it to where everybody has to kind of show off their skills and ultimately showcase to us that they can really do some very unique things. So ultimately we have it to where every single one of them have to jump really high, and justifiably we have it to where that they jump really high, one of them misses and ends up falling. seemingly down this really dark um, Esh like fall, which ultimately this place is surrounded eventually with water and this and that. So eventually, bizarrely, I guess they all otherwise decide to all jump into seemingly this same hole as well as with everyone else. Because ultimately, I guess they would just figure out that they all have superpowers, and so reasonably they all decide to just all jump down here. Because ultimately, there is something that is pushing them to want to all jump down into this hole. And so once they all jump down into this hole, they're starting to realize the water is starting to rise, and justifiably, Billy is starting to swim around into this water, and then ultimately realize that when swimming, he had been able to bizarrely kind of have his hand go through the water to meet to some other point to where ultimately there is absolutely no water. So all of the Power Rangers end up swimming into a place to where ultimately it seems like there is some kind of force field to where ultimately the water is, yeah, it's very weird. This whole command center Ash like thing made no sense to me, and then ultimately when they have to kind of come back to it later on, made no sense. It's like, dude, you would think after the first iteration of this whole like power center command center thing that ultimately they would just phase into coming back uh, into the command center. You would think they would just teleport them in like they did in the show, but no, they don't do that at all. So every single time you have to go a million miles away to come back to the command center to ultimately talk to Zordon again, and they have to do that every single day, which makes no sense. So we have it to where ultimately we at first meet Alpha 5 that seems to justifiably know a lot about English and know a lot about like the world, because ultimately I think he had spent a plethora of time going through the Earth's TV and learning the language via that. And ultimately Alpha talks about how lonely he has been and this and that. I guess Alpha is supposed to be quasi somewhere ballparkingly a comedic relief like thing, but I can't really quite understand or grasp that. So basically, we have it to where in the very beginning of this, like we were supposed to showcase off this command center, which ultimately the reason why I say command center is normally where Zordon and Alpha are being placed. In this movie, instead of it being a command center or some housing like environment that really sticks out somewhere, instead, we have it to where in this movie it is just some alien ship that ultimately Alpha had that was dug underneath the ground because of, I guess, after a meteor hit, just kind of drove this ship underground. And now, like, basically, like Alpha doesn't need a food source to survive, and evidently this ship doesn't need really a power source to survive. So, anyways, we have it to where Alpha eventually is welcoming the Rangers, ultimately telling them that they are Power Rangers, and then ultimately queuing up Zordon, who ultimately doesn't even realize that he is dead, or ultimately doesn't even realize that he is no longer a Power Ranger, that ultimately there is a new group of team of this and that. So ultimately we have it to where pushing every single one of the Power Rangers to basically just say, okay, well now you guys all need to morph. Like, come on, morph it out. Come on, everybody, morph. You can do it. So reasonably, there's a giant batch of montaging where they are supposed to learn how to fight within these holographic or hologram or copy like variations of putties, which ultimately when Rita finally does unleash putties, it's just like, okay, well, like so basically we're having a lot of putty fighting in this film, but the putty fighting is not really them like learning as they go along. No, it's basically used as a training exercise where Alpha is telling them how to fight said putties in some training thing, which I ultimately just found was just like, okay, like we're taking a lot of time to have people learn how to fight one another, and I just kind of find that absurd to me because it's like, okay, like a lot of stretch of learning how to do simple combat skills and not getting to the point of like, okay, main focus should be on morphing and then get to the point of the transitional moments of like, okay, we're going to fight the minions at first and then we're going to get to the real threat, uh, and then get to the even realer threat and this and that. So going into this, basically the kids take seemingly an hour or more to just morph. Basically, it's basically just Zordon telling them it's like morph, do it now, just morph. Come on, looking at his watch, like, come on, you guys should have morphed by now. It should have been simple to you. It should have been easy, and also forcibly just showcasing that there are Zords that exist, but recently it's just like, well, okay, well, reasonably a lot of times people wouldn't know what they are, and or ultimately they would have to be the Zords would have originally have to be called. Now I think like as far as Zords go, like they're really kind of lazy with Zords. Basically, they just now on every single Power Rangers show, they basically just showcase, yeah, here's the Zords already on the pilot episode. Here you go. They already have existed for a long period of time. And now, hey, go and play with them, even if you don't even know how to use them yet. And ultimately, we have Zach, who commandeers his Mastodon Zord and then just goes and plays around with it. Here's my thing. So ultimately when anybody else gets their Zords, it seems that not only like there isn't any like learning curve for the Zords. Like it seems like everybody could ask like off camera, like Zach, like, hey, how did you do the Zord? And he could just like, oh yeah, just do it like this. You would have thought while they were doing the Zord sequence in here, they would have been asking Zach the entire time how exactly to drive the Zords because he was the first one to actually be in the cockpit of a Zord. But instead, they basically all quickly learn how to do the Zords and do them well, which doesn't make sense to me. So, we bust out all the morphing and fighting montages. We'll just toss those all out there. I thought like there's some give and take things going on here with Jason's dad kind of really talking crap to his son and ultimately being the father that is like telling his son that like he could have really been great, but he's consistently blowing it. Because recently you have pretty much all these kids where their parents like aren't exactly there for them, or like most of their parents are sick and dying, or they have to take care of them. And that's what we find out when eventually they consistently can't morph, and so ultimately they all just decide to otherwise just have a campfire together. And ultimately Zach mentions the real reason probably why they haven't morphed yet is just the fact that they don't even know one another. It doesn't really feel like a team, which ultimately within this movie the focus isn't really on a team, it's mostly on Jason and or portions of Billy. So going into this, ultimately we have to talk about uh, Zach's sick mother, I believe, or sick relative. We ultimately have to find out that Trini is ultimately interested in girls, and ultimately she has a problem seemingly with her family, a lot of distrust there, where ultimately she is like she's right out telling her family that, hey, yeah, I'm a Power Ranger and I'm probably going to go and save the world. And they're immediately telling her, like, hey, go and pee in this cup because we don't trust you. I think you took drugs or something like that. And, like, recently, I think that's a little extreme to ultimately, like, force your kid to go and just, like, pee in a cup because they're going to go and, like, test to see if this person has drugs in their system. Like, you know what? I would probably just take it as a joke, or I would probably just go, yeah, sure. Like, because recently you have Trini kind of telling us um, that her parents are probably too strict on her, and then ultimately they are um, not really fully fledgedly like they're seeing her as a problem child, and that's all they see her as. So all right, so obviously, yeah. So now we have them all in the fireplace, all talking to one another, getting ultimately a feel of who everyone is. And so now it's kind of pushing them to, once they are now practicing together and they're all starting to uh, fight one another and still realize that, like, I'm assuming the real reason for reasonably them getting to the point of morphing is basically they're all starting to much more realize that they should actually be a team much rather than so them fighting amongst themselves. So yeah, we have it to where within this movie that Zach and Jason are fighting, they're butting heads because reasonably, it seems like a lot of times you have to go in this movie and really rationalize why is Jason taking up so much camera time. So we have to where Zach and Jason are both butting heads, and then Billy goes in to mitigate this fight, and ultimately he morphs in the process. I guess the real pushing factor of them realizing that they should be able to morph is these characters morph when there is a real, true, legitimate danger that they desperately want to prevent. And so that is pushing Billy to morph, but then eventually, when Billy loses that focus or loses that ability to then understand the reason of him not having this power, he quickly loses it, and then all the other Rangers are trying to ask Billy how is it that he could figure out how to morph. And so then, of course, with Bryan Cranston's character being very much the stickler of like looking at his watch and ultimately saying like, "Hey, yeah, it's great, one of you morphed, but like, can you do it again? Can all of you do it? Can all of you figure it out now? Like, you guys should have been morphing like 10 days ago. Like, basically, as soon as you got these coins, immediately you should have morphed. Immediately you should have taken down Rita, and immediately you should have saved the world." Because Rita, while being kept away and left away onto some boat ship to be found while there are some fishermen all getting and fixing upon this boat, they ultimately find a dead body to ultimately be reported to the police, but then eventually this dead body eventually comes alive and justifiably is now roaming around Angel Grove, seemingly killing people, ultimately killing people, but then also taking people's gold. People's gold teeth, people's gold jewelry, basically going through a jeweler and taking all of his gold materials, all while also going and attacking said jewelry place with putties in hand. So we have it to where the Power Rangers aren't like they can't morph, but they're realizing that they have the power. They have to address this threat, and because ultimately we have Rita that goes right into Trina's house or Trini's house while she's sleeping at night and wakes her up and ultimately like tells her it's like, okay, well, I'm finally going to start coming after you. I'm going to start coming after you because like you're definitely not coming after me. So now I'm going to come after you. Like I know where you live, I know where you sleep. I'm coming. Like I'm going to take you all out because ultimately uh you are Zordon's cronies, and now I'm gonna take you down and like and tell you and show you that reasonably like you never deserved these coins. You were not actually worthy for these coins. That is the whole bizarre-ish thing that ends up being placed within this movie about people being worthy, as if they all have instead of power coins, they're all holding on to Mjolnir. I don't get what this thing is about being worthy. I guess they might have ripped that off of the Thor movie. To who be worthy has to like. I don't get what that whole thing is now, where you have to have people being worthy of a power ring or a hammer or a now power coin to be a Power Ranger. You have to be worthy. I think that whole thing kind of stems from the Thor movie, but I think it's just like you ultimately have it to where Alpha is justifying to Zordon that it's like, well, the power coins wouldn't have chose people by mistake. There's a whole reason why these kids were chosen to be Power Rangers. So we ultimately have each one of the Power Rangers ending up confronting Rita, and of course, clearly ending up one by one getting the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles treatment. Basically, they all try to either one by one or all together try to confront Rita, all by this kind of like boating dock like area. And slowly but surely, they are all pretty much getting wiped out. Basically, it gets to the point to where Rita basically um, ties the Power Rangers within all these nettings, kind of alluding to the point of that she is going to kill them all, but it never really gets to that point. Ultimately, Rita is again playing with her food instead of eating it. So we have it to where the Power Rangers are realizing how really and truly just like they just can't go in here thinking that they are just now going to use their superhero edge like powers and try to just out muscle Rita, because it won't work that way. Because Rita is outthinking them at any point in juncture. Because not only does she have like a veteran like skill, but then also she has the what would be called probably the glow stick of destiny, some kind of bizarre looking staff. So we have it to where now the Power Rangers are desperately just like hey man, like we really need to now, like we need to morph, like we need to save our city, and we need to very much go into the mode of like okay, we need to do this not only for ourselves, but we need to do this for our town, or otherwise we're going to slowly but surely see that Rita is going to take down our city, and ultimately there is an allusion to Zeo crystals that are ultimately hidden away within under a Krispy Kreme, and ultimately Billy is knowing full-fledgedly well where that is, and that eventually Rita will find these crystals, because ultimately that is her seemingly new position, is to, instead of just killing the Rangers, ultimately she is going to find these crystals before they do, and even though Billy already knows where they are, she is going to get them to have a team go up against them. Like, I think so. Here's the malarkey-ish like thing. So we have the malarkey of, like, I think Rita wanting to marinate on not really killing the Rangers. She wants to play with her food before she eats it, because ultimately she wants to serve them up to Goldar. But then also she has this whole, like, Zeo crystal side thing going, which ultimately is just like, okay, well, like, what is Rita's like? So that is a whole thing that kind of godsmacks me. So is basically like, what is Rita's real motivation here? Is like, what is all of her real and true goals? Is she wanting to create a portion of Power Rangers for her own? Is she wanting to is she just wanting to is she very much wanting the Zeo crystals just so that way the Power Rangers aren't much more powerful to go up against her? Is Rita just stalling for Goldar, knowing full well that Goldar is much more powerful than she is, which I can't really buy that myself? There's so many things here that I'm trying to figure out of what is Rita's motivation, because when looking at it, if she could kill the Power Rangers, why not pull it off now? Why not do it now and get it over with? And what is she waiting for? Uh, what is her stalling tactic? I don't quite understand. So we have it to where we get it to where the Power Rangers eventually do actually all get together and they all morph. So they all morph, and then they all decide to otherwise go into Angel Grove and to start taking down Rita, who is ultimately seemingly narrowing down where the Zeo crystals are. And so by and large, we have all the Power Rangers going to the location that they absolutely know where the Zeo crystals are. And so by and large, there is a plethora and or number of putties to stall all of the Rangers. So reasonably, we have it to where seemingly there is too many putties to count, and to the point where the Power Rangers are very much getting overwhelmed, to ultimately they just otherwise decide to just toss themselves all into all of their Zords, to ultimately think that the Zords can very much take down all of the putties and this and that. All while we eventually have it to where there is a Goldar coming to eventually match said Zords, and ultimately leaving Jason's father in some kind of car accident where eventually Jason has to get out of his Zord to rescue his father, ultimately very much cementing that Jason's father was giving him crap in the beginning of this film, but Jason still loves his father enough to rescue him from quite possible certain death, and ultimately knowing full well that Jason's father was saved at the end of this, maybe he will have a different outlook on life, maybe? I don't know. Ultimately, him having that newspaper clipping at the end of this movie, like, I don't know, like, I guess giving Jason's father a second chance on life maybe is making him think differently about things. Ultimately, not being as hard on his son because maybe a younger Esh looking uh, character saving his life, maybe, I don't know, could be any number of solutions and this and that. Or maybe um, it seemed to maybe Jason's father that maybe it could be possible that Jason, considering of how seemingly elusive Jason is currently, that ultimately Jason could be a Power Ranger because ultimately he might know his son, he might know like his voice and this and that. So could ultimately mean that Jason's father knows that Jason is a Power Ranger. Who knows? Maybe that's why he has the newspaper clipping on the fridge. It could be any number of things. I don't know. So we have it to where Jason is now kind of flying around in the T Rex, and ultimately all the other Zords are kind of just kind of clearing down some of the putties, ultimately waiting for us to eventually have Goldar come down, but then eventually there is some kind of attacking Rita as well, because ultimately knowing full well that both Rita and or Goldar are both threats in this movie. Rita isn't exactly going to be at any point in time throwing on the green Power Ranger suit, but then also she is not also going to be really growing up to or growing to be a skyscraper like monster for her to take down the Power Rangers at any point, because ultimately that's what she's leaving Goldar to be. So yeah, ultimately, so we have it to where Goldar, ultimately they have it to where all of the guys bizarrely figure out that they're supposed to be becoming much more of a Megazord. So eventually it seems that once the Power Rangers all take down, of course, Goldar, because they kick and punch their way, figuring out that each one of them have certain functions of this Megazord. It seems that Billy wanted to be able to be the fist of this Zord, but instead he's the leg. So ultimately, there seems to be very much a balancing act where ultimately at some points they have it to where Jason is calling out to Zach to just kind of level them off, because it seems like they are kind of falling backwards, and so Jason calls out to Zach um, to re-steady them back up, and of course Zach does. Uh, basically, Kimberly ends up punching Goldar, and basically Jason is really just kind of like being a proud dad within this whole like Megazord like moment, where ultimately he is kind of like telling them like what all to really do, but then also when they do something, he's like a proud father that's like, yeah, hey man, that was a good punch. And so basically repetitively have these like punch and kick esh like maneuvers. Basically it comes down to them of course having a Power Rangers blade like weapon to just kind of just like weapon of sorts to take down Goldar and to kill him, of course. Kind of after the killing of Goldar, like the rest of this movie just kind of becomes like a wrapping up like maneuver or a mood point like gesture to basically just say that it's like, well, hey, since we took Goldar down, like Rita is kind of a mood point, and so reasonably, like it kind of gets down to where, like, since Goldar is defeated, like Rita is just like, you know what, I'm bouncing, like I'm out of here, and so we have it to where everybody is like so proud of their victory, and Zordon I think should be eating some crow right now because reasonably he lost in the way of which the Power Rangers succeeded. So reasonably, like, every one of them all come back to the command center and they huzzah, they all think they won, and because ultimately reasonably they naturally assume that they all like beat Rita and beat Goldar and beat everything. But when looking at it, it's just like you kind of even barely remember a lot of the fight moments of this whole wrapping of the ending. You just kind of realize like, okay, hey, cue the Zord. Like, it's copy and paste of any other normal Power Ranger show where you have Goldar being beaten by some blade movement, and you have Rita who eventually flocks away, not getting the Zeo crystals, but it doesn't even really seem like the Power Rangers are going to get the Zeo crystals as well. It just seems like they're holding the Zeo crystals off at some Krispy Kreme for reasons. You would think that the command center would then take the Zeo crystals and then eventually use them at some point in a sequel, or at the end of this movie, they would get to change seemingly into new Rangers. But anyways, so we have it to where Jason puts back his power sword into the command center, and Zordon is telling Jason, it's like, well, hey, like, why are you putting that away? It's like, I'm sure you're gonna get quite a bit of usage out of that in the future, and Jason is like, well, yeah, maybe I will, and because ultimately the whole thing that I completely negated and completely didn't mention is the whole entire, because I think it's just kind of a stupid moot point thing, because at some point in this movie, let's taper back. At some point when Rita was fighting the Power Rangers, Billy had to die. Zordon was figuring out a way to ultimately come back uh, as his alien being instead of some guy on a wall, and so ultimately they had figured out how to get Billy, or to get Zordon back to life, because ultimately Zordon wanted to be a Red Ranger again. So in the meantime, Rita is killing Billy, and so they end up rushing Billy to the command center, and so what ends up happening is that Billy dies, and so Zordon, instead of trying to put himself before anyone else, Zordon takes Billy from seemingly a afterlife like way and pushing him back into seemingly his own body to be alive yet again, and then ultimately Zordon is not able to follow Billy in his footsteps, and so Zordon is still being back on the wall, digitally enhanced, and so ultimately, really, I think the dying of Billy probably puts the team in perspective that now they have to morph, and now like basically this death of Billy like pushed them to all cement that they really are all a team, but and that's what actually pushes them to morph for the first time, and then pushes them to eventually try to take Rita down because literally she is killing people. So it pushes them even more to morph, to have armor, and to take Rita and Golar down. And so now, because alluding that to Jason that there can only be one Red Ranger, and that is Jason. This is his team, and this is his time. And so now, towards the very end of this, we are basically now to showcase that like Zordon is now eating crow and telling the Power Rangers, it's like, yeah, you did it. You won where I could not, and so like it's great for all of you to be able to have accomplished this, and like basically like you guys should all like revel in this victory that you now have, but like but yeah, but still, it's just like, well, there's always a new threat coming. There's always a new world to save, and this and that. So basically, huzzah on everybody. And so recently, now they're kind of going about their own separate lives to eventually accumulate to be Power Rangers yet again. But recently, they're all going their separate ways to tell you that they all are like after saving the world, everything is going much easier for them, and so they're all just having a like, yeah, they're still stuck in detention, but they're much more happier about it. They're in a much better place for most of every single one of them because they saved the world. And so reasonably, there's a whole entire scene alluding to there being a Tommy being added to detention, but Tommy is not even at this detention because heaven forbid you actually show Tommy in this movie. So yeah, that's all I'd probably have to say about this movie. Recently, to me, yeah, I kind of like forgot about certain things, like the whole like what really happened to Rita. But going into this, I'm assuming if they do a sequel, I don't think Rita is actually going to be anything to be showcased. I think probably in a sequel, if they're going to do one, um, more than likely they're probably going to go with a whole different threat, or otherwise they should actually probably push into doing Lord Zed and very much pushing into Zeo territory, because what was the whole point of doing Zeo crystals if to not ultimately go into that direction and do that, but do it with a Lord Zed this time around instead of doing it with some other villain-esh like person that, because I'm assuming they are going to pretty much next the whole Ninjetti thing, because why wouldn't they? So I don't think this movie is probably ever going to actually legitimately get a sequel. If anything, reasonably, I don't think that this movie is going to be received very well warmly if they even do a sequel. I just think that Power Rangers should just stick with what is consistently a success with them, is just to keep popping out shows, better quality shows, I hope. But reasonably, they should just stick with that. I think them trying to create more merchandising opportunities is kind of just a kind of scoff on a lot of people. Because like with Ninja Turtles and with Power Rangers, it's like that's all that really is. Basically, I don't think that the people that were doing this movie really cared about how the visuals were. They just cared that they were pushing them out there, and that ultimately, eventually, at some point, that this was also just another marketing opportunity to push out, hey, look at this. We're going to push out just another batch of Power Rangers merchandise, which ultimately, I think, there was a lot of stuff that was utterly hilarious to me because there was a lot of merchandise being pushed out that honestly didn't make any sense. Trying to really market off of the fact that, like, hey, let's push out Power Rangers costumes, let's push up Power Rangers morphers that were never used in the movie, and products that were probably never even really showcased through any portion of this film really all that well. So, going into this, I think that's all I have to say about this movie. I probably took too long to dissect it and kind of go over it. If anything, there was some stuff that I went into much more detail or kind of bashingly put it all out there and this and that. So, yeah, that's all I have to say about this movie, and I probably took way too long to talk about it. So at the end of the day, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.